Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. We don't live in Iceland, but if we did, we would be today mourning the passing of what is called OK. Its full name is Okjolkul. I don't know what that is or what it means. But OK is a glacier that covered 6.2 square miles in 1890. Today, by 2012, it has shrunk to less than 3/10 of a mile. And in 2014, Icelandic scientists decided it was no longer moving. So there's about 100 people, including Iceland's Prime Minister, Ireland's former president, and others, holding ceremonies where the glacier used to be, doing that today to commemorate its passing. This is the country that aborts nearly 100% of all babies diagnosed with Down syndrome. But they're holding a funeral for a glacier. They have put up a bilingual Icelandic English plaque. It's entitled A Letter to the Future. See, OK is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. This article reads, this letter. In the next 200 years, it claims all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This moment, or monument rather, is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. According to Breitbart, this event brought a death certificate into being. One of the leaders there of the nation of Iceland actually filled out a death certificate, bringing attention to the climate crisis. What killed this glacier? Climate crisis. Pope Francis weighed in. He didn't go, but he alluded to the extinct glacier earlier this month when he was interviewed by an Italian newspaper, La Stampa, while explaining the relationship between his encyclical Laudato Si and the upcoming synod on Amazon. Francis said, quote, "The other day I read about a huge glacier in Iceland, that melted almost completely. They built a funeral monument." Now, there is one sad irony about the disappearing Icelandic glaciers. In Iceland, babies with Down syndrome regularly disappear. In fact, almost everyone with Down syndrome is aborted before he or she is born. In 2009, only 3 babies in Iceland were born with the genetic condition. By 2017, no Down syndrome baby had been born there in 5 years. Is this a natural evolution? Consider the North American continent was covered with ice down to and into the U.S. just a few hundred years ago. Nobody had a funeral when that layer of ice receded out of Pennsylvania and New York and Maine and much of Canada. You see, at the time of what scientists call the Pleistocene era, the continents had moved to their current positions. At one point during the Ice Age, sheets of ice covered all of Antarctica, large parts of Europe, North America, South America, and small areas in Asia. In North America, they stretched over Greenland, Canada, and parts of northern United States. The remains of glaciers of the Ice Age can still be seen in parts of the world, including Greenland and Antarctica. But the glaciers did not just sit there. There was a lot of movement over time. There were about 20 cycles when the glaciers would advance and retreat as they thawed and refroze. Scientists identified the Pleistocene epoch's 4 key stages or ages as the Galician, Calabrian, Ionian, and Tarantian. Now the term or the name Pleistocene is the combining of 2 Greek words, a Greek word meaning most and the Greek word meaning new or recent. It was first used in 1839 by Sir Charles Lyell, a British geologist and lawyer. As a result of Lyell's work, the glacial theory gained acceptance between 1839 and 1846, and scientists came to recognize the existence of ice ages. During this period, British geologist Edward Forbes aligned the period with other known ice ages. In 2009, the International Union of Geological Sciences established the start of the Pleistocene epoch at 2.588 million years before the present. Now, biblicists would argue that dating. The Bible indicates the world began probably not more than about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And we have the chronologies of families in the Bible that measure about 6,000 years. Biblical scientists answer the question by pointing to a creation that assumes an age which is really not. That God created the earth with the image of age. But back to the freezing issue. In the early days, they claim, the climate was much colder and drier than it is today. Since most of the water on Earth's surface was ice, there was little precipitation and rainfall, about half what we have today. So the question becomes, when was the Earth covered mostly with water? Well, the Bible says about 600 years after creation, somewhere around 5,500, 6,000 years ago. During these days, these years, the peak periods, with most of the water frozen, the global average temperatures were between 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, 9 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That much below today's temperature norms because of the ice. There were also winters and summers during that period. The variation in temperatures produced glacial advances because the cooler summers didn't completely melt the snow. Now, all that is scientific theory based on what we do know about water and ice. But written history seems to support the theory. This is where the Little Ice Age comes in. The Little Ice Age lasted from early 14th century through the mid-19th century. It wasn't a deep freeze like the long ice ages of ancient past. After all, human civilization thrived and expanded during the Little Ice Age as several civilizations sent ships to explore, colonize, and exploit new lands. Nevertheless, images depicted in paintings, data from ships' logs, and scientific reports of the time and other historical writings have shown that many parts of Europe experienced cooler than normal conditions during this time. Since the people of the time did not keep accurate weather records, like we do today, present-day scientists are looking to understand the climate of the Little Ice Age, but they are having to rely on proxy records. These are indirect sources of climatic information, coral growths, the cores of lake sediments, ice cores, annual rings in trees, and so forth. In order to better understand the regional and global climates of the time. Proxy records showed that mountain glaciers grew during the Little Ice Age at several locations, including the European Alps, New Zealand, Alaska, and the southern Andes. And mean annual temperatures across the northern hemisphere fell by about 1.1 degrees Fahrenheit relative to the average temperature between 1000 and 2000 BC. Proxy records collected from western Greenland, Scandinavia, the British Isles, western North America point to several cool episodes lasting several decades each, when temperatures dropped to 1.8 to 3.6 Fahrenheit, below the 1,000-year averages of those areas. These regional temperature declines, however, rarely occurred at the same time. In addition, temperatures of other regions, like China and the Andes Mountains of South America, were fairly stable, while other regions, such as Europe, North America, in the Mississippi Valley, and parts of Africa and Asia, became drier and had droughts lasting several years at a time. Now, though scientists don't agree on what caused the Little Ice Age, most agree the climate cooled from the 15th to the middle of the 19th century, with the greatest intensity being between 1550 and 1700. Some scientists peg the coldest period even more narrowly, between 1645 and 1715. During that period, the average winter temperatures in North America fell 2 degrees Celsius. The Little Ice Age brought cool summers and bitterly cold winters to New England. During the Great Snow of 1717, for example, a series of snowstorms buried houses and got search parties lost looking for them. The Cold Friday of 1810 also belonged to the Little Ice Age. People died in their homes when the temperature suddenly plummeted more than 60 degrees in less than a day. Years later, Henry David Thoreau's mother remembered how dishes froze as fast as they were washed right next to the fire. The Little Ice Age had a huge impact on the development of New England. There are at least 6 ways that it made history. During the Little Ice Age, George Washington and his army suffered through the cold of Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-1778. But contemporary observers actually called the winter unusually mild. Washington and his troops suffered more in Morristown, New Jersey, in 1779 than they did in Valley Forge. Violent snowstorms battered the Northeast that winter, and both Boston and New York harbors froze over. The weather made it impossible to bring supplies to the men, many of whom had no coats or shoes and didn't eat for days at a time. The soldiers finally mutinied in early May, though an officer persuaded them to abandon their rebellion. Extremely harsh winters during the Little Ice Age destroyed the first colony in what is now Maine and delayed colonization in New England for a good 10 years. A group of English investors called the Plymouth Company chartered something called the Popham Colony, also known as the Sagadahoc Colony in coastal Maine. 2 ships carrying 120 settlers set sail in May 1607 under the leadership of George Popham. Popham's death and the winter of 07, described as extreme, unreasonable, and frosty, drove the colonists back to England. Sir Fernando Gorges, one of the investors, recalled 1662, all our former hopes were frozen to death. As a result, English interest in colonizing New England disappeared for at least another decade. Explorer John Smith expressed the view of New England as a cold, barren, mountainous, rocky desert. In the 1600s, the French failed to colonize on the island of St. Croix and the river that divides Canada from the United States. 79 men arrived in the summer of 1604 and thought they found a paradise with warm weather, good soil, plenty of fish and game. Then it began to snow on October 6. It began a long and sharply cold winter. 35 men died of a hideous, mysterious disease, probably scurvy. When spring finally arrived, they moved to what is now Annapolis, Nova Scotia. Had the weather not been so severe, New England might be New France today. In 1816, known as the year without a summer, 6 inches of snow fell in June, and every month of the year had a hard frost. Temperatures dropped as low as 40 degrees in July and August. People also called it the 1800 and froze to death year and the poverty year. The cold, dry weather of 1816 created a craving for warmer weather and fertile soils out west. Hundreds and tens thousands of New England families gave up their farms, packed their belongings into wagons, and joined the throngs, traipsing over rivers and mountains to Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley, areas which include Ohio, West Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. Between 1810 and 1820, Maine lost as many as 15,000 people. Most left after the year without a summer. 60 Vermont towns lost population during that decade. The population of 60 more Vermont towns stayed the same while the U.S. population grew by 32%. Massachusetts gained only 50,000 people from 1810 to 1820. Ohio gained 5 times as many. The Massachusetts legislature tried to hold on to the citizens by passing a Homestead Act that gave settlers 100 acres of land for $5. The story about the Little Ice Age was updated in 2018. Now, we learned in school about the ice that moved down from Canada to cover most of the New England colonies, only to recede back to northern Canada and beyond in the days just prior to the English settlers that came in early 1600s. But the point here is that evolutionists and others are worried about the warming of the planet, the melting of the icebergs, the receding of the ice caps today. But history indicates that this has been going on for thousands of years. In fact, a great deal of populated areas and arable land was once covered in ice. The warming of the planet is apparently not a threat. It isn't threatening our life the way we're being told. It's a 5,000-year-old cycle born of a planet once covered with water. Water which would have cooled the earth. Water which would recede and which would be frozen, only to thaw out, creating larger oceans, then to freeze again, creating glaciers and icebergs which broke off as glaciers, only to see the temperatures level out. Antarctica in the south is largely a huge pile of ice sitting on a continent early cartographers and sailors knew to be dry land. The godless scientists calling themselves experts fear the unknown. They are forced by their academic theories to fear the melting of the polar ice caps. Yeah, as the ice melts, continents could shrink, their shorelines receding and the water increasing. But destroying all life as we know it? That's a little bit of a stretch. Given that the planet has been going through this for thousands of years, and we're still here. Where did all this water come from? Oh, we have that ancient tale about a time when God flooded the earth with water and only 8 souls survived.